application with the things that we are going through and that we are studying. Today we're going to be looking at verses 24 through the remainder of the chapter of Matthew chapter 7. And we're going to be asking the question and answering the question, who is wise and who is a fool? I'm sure this is a passage of section, a piece of information that very many of us are familiar with. But just because we are familiar with it, we do not need to look at it from the standpoint of, well, I already know what this says, so therefore I can tune out. So I appreciate the prayer that was led during our collection, that we will stay attentive to this information, because I'm wanting to bring some information that I think to a large degree we overlook when we are considering the overall context of what is being discussed, and we lose the heart of what Jesus is addressing when it comes to this illustration that we have being given. This is all, in fact, still connected in the entire chapter, and not only just this chapter, but chapters 5 through 6. This is where Jesus has been leading us. We get to this section, and it starts with a therefore, and we realize that that is going to be a statement of summarization. So for introduction, we would consider how that many want to ignore the fact that God indeed discriminates. We saw that in verses 1 through 6, in that of judging. We have to be involved in judgment, and not only involved in judgment, but even being able to discern and to qualify, well, who's a false prophet? That takes the proper measuring tool, and that being God's Word. And the very fact that we have God not only in discrimination, but God is involved in segregation as well. He is involved in the practice of separating those that will be in the kingdom and those that will be out of the kingdom. Even Paul would write in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17 that if we want Him to be called our Father and we to be called His children, then this is what we must do. Wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. The very word church itself means to be called out. We are the called out ones. It's a called out people. Well, called out from what? We've been called out, separated from the world. We do not think like the world thinks. We do not behave like the world behaves. And therefore, there's a line of distinction being drawn. And through Jesus' entire sermon, He has been drawing this line between those that will be in the kingdom and those that will be out of it. If you will follow and you will do these certain things, then you can be in the kingdom. But if you're not going to do these things, you will not be in the kingdom. Jesus will use this term of distinction of the wise and the foolish several times in His teaching. So some might look at our title and consider, well, you really shouldn't be going around calling anybody a fool. Well, Jesus is in this very illustration. He describes the class of people this very way. Either you're going to be a wise man or you're going to be a fool. If you don't like the terms, you can take them up with Jesus. He's the one that used them. So when we're considering these ideas, we need to make sure that we're keeping them in line and that we will, in fact, use the proper terminology, the proper distinctions that even Jesus would use. If Jesus were here today, would He be using these terms? Absolutely, He would be, because He used them there. And He will also discuss that separation in this conclusion of His sermon. But as I mentioned, we will also discuss something I think gets left out, and it's something that we've been studying throughout this entire section. So let's begin with verse 24. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. The word therefore, what is it there for? It's because of everything that's been said before now. Here is the conclusion of everything that's been preached from the start of chapter 5 to what we've gone through in chapter 7. There whosoever, this is open to everyone and anyone. This is the exact same statement that we saw earlier in chapter 7 and verse 8. Everyone that asks shall receive. Everyone that seeks shall find. And everyone that knocks, it will be opened unto them. These sayings, that is including what's been mentioned in chapter 5, 6, now in 7, and anything that's going to follow thereafter. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, these instructions, these teachings, everything and anything that Jesus has and will teach, even to the least of his commandments, he is including all that he is going to say. You've got to hear him. So for our world today, that would question, well, what about this idea of rule keeping? This idea of checking things off of our list, that there are requirements that we must follow. Jesus is saying he's getting down to the very minutest point, sounding pretty legalistic. We do not have any right to start looking at things that Jesus has taught and that we get to start ignoring them. But not only do we need to be in the practice of hearing these things, we must not simply hear them, we must also do them. Hears and does, I will liken him unto a wise man. We must do so that we can in fact be in the qualification of a wise person. Some might look at this and say, well, that sounds like a legalist mentality. I don't know what to tell you. These are the words of Christ. Either you can take them or leave them. If you don't like what this has to say, I'm sure you can find a group out there that will broaden the way for you to where you don't have to follow this. They might say, well, it sounds legalistic, based on work, effort, things that you're having to do. The religious world today says there's nothing that a person has to do so as to find themselves as being a wise person, one that's walking in that straight and narrow way. But yet Jesus says if you want to be in that way, then this is what you need to do. What they're saying is absolutely right. But what are we to do so as to help others as we're considering these points? What we're doing strengthens us, but it also finds us in a position where we're able to help others in their problems. When we are considering the fact that he goes on and he states in verse 25, and the rain descended and the floods came and the winds blew and beat upon the house and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. My life is being illustrated by the house. The wise man that builds his house, his life, upon the rock. And that is the process of changing my character, changing my inner strength. You know, a house is only as strong as its foundation. You can have big plans, and in fact, you can build a glamorous mansion, but if it's built on a shaky foundation, it doesn't matter how it looks on the outside or even on the inside. It's not going to last long. Then, in fact, it's going to decay faster than what you were planning. If my life is built on the Christ, and if my life is built on his sayings and me doing them, then what about when the storms of life come? I will be strong to face whatever comes. You've got a sure foundation and you've got a strong house. What about when winds come? Are you worried? No. We're assured on what we've been built. The rain starts coming down. Are you concerned? No. Even if it started to flood, would you be concerned? No, because we built ourselves on a foundation that's going to allow our lives and us to stand. I will not crumble under the stress and strain that life can possibly bring. And this is what it takes. Just as we studied in this chapter, with clear spiritual vision, what does it bring? It brings peace. Jesus said in chapter 6, do not be anxious. Do not be full of care. Well, how is that even possible? Because we're focused on the right things. We're focused on the things of God, and that brings relief. If my life is built upon Christ and His teachings, what does that bring? It brings peace. It brings assurance. It brings comfort that even in the midst of the storm, I don't have to panic. Now that right there is a huge point for us to consider as we go through trial, tribulation, how we behave, and the fact that others are going to see that. I have heard of tales of brethren that have found themselves going through different struggles, and people that are not members of the church watch them. And they view them go through this difficulty and how that it doesn't break them. And they bear up underneath it. And their friends that are not members of the church, they come and bring questions. What is it that would make you go through something and just smile through it? Not complain, not curse God, not ask why, throw a pity party, you just go through it. It's what happens when we follow what Jesus says. When we take in the assurance and the comfort of what He's teaching, and that if God watches over a sparrow, and if we really recognize and realize that He's numbered the hairs on my head, then what about when this happens? He's not left us. He's watching, just as He always has. So it brings peace, assurance. It removes anxiety. And as we are considering this, this is on the basis of individual application. This is not our lives, even though it finds application in that. First and foremost, this is not our lives collectively as the church. This is talking about me on an individual, personal level. My life needs to be built on this. But as we find this individual application, we also find application with the church collective. We are lively stones built on the foundation of Christ to make up a spiritual house, a spiritual temple. And what if we have a weak brick in the house? That can cause a problem. And even then, when you're building a house, you do not just take any type of shape of rock or any type of shape of brick and start trying to cram that into the house. The brick has to already be formed so as to fit in line. And too many times when it comes to trying to build up the Lord's house, too many times we may find ourselves just simply trying to force any type of brick or stone in there that doesn't fit. When we should be realizing, okay, if we're going to put another brick on this building, we got to start forming it before we put it in there. Which means that these teachings, as we just mentioned, are crucial, are pivotal if we're going to have people be converted, so as to have them fit into the church and not have the church fit them. This is the straight and narrow way, strict, rigorous, filled with perplexities and distresses. So when I consider my life and how I'm able to face the problems of life, here's the assurance that we can make it through. Here's the assurance that we can be labeled as a wise individual. If I hear what He says, but not just simply hear it, but then do it, this is what my life will be like. But then there's the contrast. Verse 26 through 27. Everyone that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rains descended, And the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Now, what about a teacher or preacher today that says Christianity is not about a bunch of do's and don'ts? That says your salvation, being accepted by God, being blessed, is not determined by what you do. Jesus says very clearly, that's a fool. And we have the majority of the religious world that thinks that way. And what does that mean? We've got more fools out there than we do wise people. Now again, some folks may not like that terminology, but you can take it up with God. And if you do not like, if you consider your life and you start considering, okay, this is where I am, well then change what you're doing. You don't like that label? God simply says, then change. Notice, the hearing goes out to everyone. Who hasn't heard what Jesus has had to say? There's not a single person out in the world today that has not had an opportunity to at least say that they've heard something. But you see, hearing is not necessarily the hard part. It's this doing section that people don't like. But it's the doing section that determines who you're going to be. If you're wise, then you will practice what Jesus is preaching. But if you want to be a foolish person, then just ignore it. These individuals that would say it's not based upon anything that you do are foolish men. It's that kind of person that is the false prophet, the false teacher mentioned in this section of Matthew chapter 7. Trying to widen that gate, trying to make even broader the way. They have this idea, well, we're making it easier. No, actually all you're doing is making people's lives harder, as is shown by the illustration. What's their life going to become if you start trying to take this away? Their life is going to come to ruin. They're going to be faced with the struggles of life, and they're not going to be prepared to face them and to take them head on. They are, in fact, leading individuals, leading people to their own destructions, leading themselves to their own destruction and leading others that will, in fact, follow them. But also look at this. Even though we have the contrast between the wise man and the foolish man, here's something that's different, but yet notice here in verse 27, that's the same thing that we read in verse 25. So what does that tell us? The same thing that's happening to the foolish man is the same thing that happened to the wise man. So do not be deceived into thinking that when you obey the gospel and you become a Christian and you start following Christ, that life is not going to have any more storms. The same storms that the world faces are the storms that we're going to face. And if you just, again, going back to hearing what Jesus says, Jesus never promised that in any of his teaching. But in fact, quite the opposite. Jesus said many times, if you're going to follow me, you're going to suffer. If he promised anything, he promised trouble. But also consider, these are everyday occurrences. This is natural stuff. Rain falling, wind blowing, floods rising up. If these are in fact everyday occurrences, then we do not need to overreact to our trials. We in fact do not need to start falling into the trap that Paul discusses in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 12. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. You mean even if I'm on that steady foundation? Yeah, absolutely. There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. You mean the things that happen to people that are out in the world, that are not following after God's precepts? Those are going to happen to me too? You mean just like how worldly people get sick, I'm going to get sick? How it is that sinners get cancer, I very likely could get cancer? People out in the world fall, stumble, break their hands? I might break my hand too, yeah. So what about when that happens? Don't blow it out of proportion. Do not start looking at what is happening to you as though there's nobody else before you that's gone through something like that. But such is a common demand, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Now here's the other point. What we have being discussed here are natural events. These are not miraculous. So if these are in fact not miraculous events, do I need a miraculous delivery? No, I do not. And too many people look at this section and say, well, God will make a way and therefore He's going to do something miraculous. No. What is the way of escape that God has given? How are we going to be able to bear it? It's what we're studying on the Sermon on the Mount. You want the way of escape? You want the way of deliverance? Hear and do what Jesus has said. And when the troubles of life come, you'll stand steady. Hear and do and stand in the midst of the storm. These are the benefits of those that are in the kingdom. We already know what the game plan is. We already know what the avenues of attack of the devil, of the enemy, are going to be. Therefore, we can stand ready. For those that have heard the gospel, believed the gospel, are willing to repent, change from a life of sin to a life of righteousness, and that are willing to confess with the mouth that Jesus is the Son of God and to be baptized in water for the remission of their sins. This is what is made possible for you. Now walk in the steps of the Savior. Did Jesus face trouble? Did Jesus face trials? Did Jesus face physical storms while He was going through this life? Absolutely He did. How did He behave? Did not even faze Him. Even when it came to the pressures of walking in the shadow of the cross, He didn't falter. He did not pull back. Why? There's a way of escape. There's a means of deliverance. He stood firm. How? Knowing that His Father was there. And these are some of the primary points, except for maybe this one, 1 Corinthians 10, 12 through 13, where most people are not willing to make the connection and the points of application, that when we consider, well, God's going to deliver, then that's got to be some new way every time life happens. No, it's always going to rain. It's always going to be windy. And it may even be a case where the waters are going to rise. And in knowing that, you know a way to beat it. So even when it comes to something like what we faced last year with the fires, I had a chance to sit down with somebody that was actually involved in fighting those fires. And he was pointing out how that when you live in a valley like what we have here, he said, even though you may not be able to feel it, the wind is constantly turning. Because throughout the day, as the valley heats up, where does that warm air want to go? It wants to go up. So the wind is going to go up the mountain. As the evening comes, that cold air hits. Where does cold air always want to go? It always wants to go down. And so he was saying, as they were fighting that fire, and as the day went along, he was saying, we knew what the fire was going to do because we know what the wind is going to do. It's always going to push it this direction. Then at different times, it's going to push it down another direction. So when it came time for those different events, they were ready. Now, me being somebody that doesn't fight fires and hasn't been in this valley all that long, when there was talk of those fires, I was pretty panicky. It was pretty much every day I was waiting for you guys to come knocking on the door, and it's like, okay, we got to go. But guess what? Somebody who's trained in that and knows, well, this is how it operates, is better prepared. And it's like, well, yeah, this is bad, but it's not as bad as it could be. Yes, people lost homes, but we were well enough prepared that nobody lost their life. It's the same type of principle for us. These are the training steps on how to deal with life. If you'll hear them and you'll do them, you'll be set. And too many times, the reason why we have so many people that are panicking and struggling through life is because they're not doing, and to a large degree, many of them are not even listening. And they're caught off guard. Now, here's a section that I believe that we miss. We generalize this, and we focus on people in the world, which, of course, it does have that application. But as we mentioned in our Bible class, Jesus is teaching this to his disciples. So this is, in fact, a warning for us first. That even though I may be a Christian, if I am not building my life on that rock, that is, I'm simply Christian in name only and not in my life, then I'm not going to be a wise person. I'm, in fact, going to be a foolish person, and my life is going to be destroyed. If I, Micah, a Christian, if I am not doing these things, then my life will crumble. I will be a foolish man. And that I will, in fact, hear Jesus say to me, as he said in verses 21 through 23, depart. I never knew you. But what we also have going on here is the same situation that we have with the section on judging. Something that we do not consider in this is, well, what about my attitude when this happens? What should my attitude be as I'm thinking about and reading about this section? What should it produce in my life, to produce in us? That is what Jesus has been pointing out this entire sermon. Our attitude, our motivations, and our actions must be the same. So just as we said with the category of judging, what should our attitude be when we see this and we have to judge somebody? It's care, it's concern. We are here to help you. That's the illustration. And that's what expresses the proper attitude. Must we judge? Yes, we must judge. What's our motivation? What if I saw this walking down the street? It would be a rush over. Man, we have got to help you. Now look at the illustration that Jesus has given us now. What if you saw this happening to one of your neighbors? What if you saw this happening to a brother or a sister, what's our motivation? What is our attitude supposed to be? With this illustration, what should we be feeling towards those that will not hear and will not do what Jesus says? Yes, those that are lost in the world, but as we said, first and foremost, this can be us. This is our own brethren. Should we just have the attitude of, that's what they get? And then we just close the door? I'm safe. If they weren't smart enough to know better, well, they're learning a lesson. Yeah, they are learning a lesson. And on one hand, it is a moment of just hand on forehead and you're shaking your head and it's just, what were you thinking? But on the other hand, it should be more of an attitude of, oh no, this is terrible. This is awful. Let me come and get you. Now, here's the thing that's really difficult about this. Physically, on the outside, we can look at people's lives and it's just, everything's fine, or so it seems. But what we are discussing are things which are internal. On the outside, everything seems like it's going fine. Everybody's smiling, everybody's happy, we've got a nice house, everything is on board. But on the inside, this is what we've got going on. They are crumbling, and they are getting swept away by the waves. So just as we mentioned about those fires that were burning last year, what emotion did it produce with us? Should it produce sadness, pity, remorse? The idea and the mentality of what can I do to help? That's what our mentality needs to be when we see our brethren struggling like this. That they are allowing themselves to be swept away because they've built their life on the wrong foundation. But this is what foolish people do not recognize about what they are doing. Now here's the other thing. This situation right here, and as we're describing it, does this, a person that hears and will not do what Jesus says, does that only affect them? That's the mentality. Well, as long as my sin is not hurting anybody else, then I'm fine. But with this physical illustration that we have of a spiritual principle, anybody else that's in this house is going to be hurt by the foolish decisions of the one building the house. What about the wife, children? And during this time frame, the parents more than likely would be living under the same house. You might even have several family members that are living under the same roof. And then I'm making foolish decisions that's bringing down the entire house on everyone else. Sin does not just stay with me. It bleeds out. But then also consider this. You've put those in the house in danger, but then what about me over here? And now I've got to come and get you. Look at what's swirling. Look at what's going on. You're now putting me in danger to where I'm having to come and get you, and I can be swept off in this. And let's just move it from the illustration of, okay, move it away from floods. What if you just say the house is on fire? All right, the house is on fire because of your foolish decisions. I'm coming in to get you. I'm still in danger. The entire building can come down on all of us. This is not an isolated situation. And so we do not need to start thinking that stuff that's going on at home, that's being problematic, is not going to bleed out to the rest of us. Because it will. It will end up putting brethren in a position where more than likely they'll have to end up picking sides. And causing a huge division not only in your personal life and in your home, but in the church at large. So what do we need to make sure that we're doing? We need to make sure that we're making wise decisions when we're building our lives, but not only that, but that when somebody calls out to us and says, hey, you don't need to build there, that we don't just shrug our shoulders, blow it off, and just say, mind your own business. Because it very well could be the case that they know something that we don't. And we have a whole host of individuals, not only in this county, in this state, in this country, throughout the world, that they are not building their lives on what Jesus has said. And even though it looks good on the outside, on the inside, they're crumbling. They're falling apart. They face the same problems and the same struggles that we do, but they're not going to come through it. So what is it that we're actually offering to people? Is it a strict, is it a rigorous way? Yes, it is. But look at this, there's safety. I don't want to be here. I want to be over here. Well, then you're going to have to meet certain standards. In my Father's house are many mansions. And if you want to get down to it, inside of the kingdom, there's a homeowners association. And Jesus is the president. And in a homeowners association, in that type of cul-de-sac, you don't get to just do whatever you want to with your house. You got to meet certain standards. And okay, if you don't want to meet those standards, you can go live somewhere else. If you want to live over here in safety when the storms of life come, and knowing that if you find yourself in trouble, there'll be somebody to come and get you, well, the Sermon on the Mount tells you what's required. But if you want to go out here and live however you wish to live, this is where you're headed. We can tell you where you're going before you even get there. But here's the difficult part of it all. That while we're sitting here and we see you come across this time that we knew was coming, that we're not just going to be there pointing the finger and saying, I told you so. That even though we tried to warn you and you would not heed our warnings, we will still make the effort to come and get you. Whether you're in the church, out of the church, we will do our best to help you from getting swept away. And many people will be swept away because this is too dangerous. This is too iffy. But it's worth the risk, so as to gain a soul. Verses 28 and 29 bring us to our conclusion. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine. They were shocked and in awe, amazement of what they were hearing. Because what were they used to? They were used to a religious system that abused them and mistreated them, that robbed them, that had an elite class, and if you were down here struggling, nobody cared. But what Jesus is presenting is no, that's not how Judaism, that's not how the law of Moses is supposed to work. And not only that, but there's a kingdom coming, and this is what it looks like. And it just sounds too good to be true. Are we going to be judged? Yes, we are going to be judged, but it's going to be by the proper standard, by the right measurement. We're going to do it because we care for you. Well, what about when I find myself in trouble? And it's my own fault. Well, you might have to suffer the consequences. You might lose your house, but there will be people that will come and get you. That they will see you in the midst of your turmoil, in the midst of your trial, and they will say, we're going to save what we can. They were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Astonishment because what Jesus was presenting was completely different from what they had heard before. Remember in chapter 5, Jesus used that phrase several times. You've heard it said of them of old time, but I say unto you. And if you consider it, the things that Jesus was teaching, they were already written. They were already there for them to know. And in teaching as one that has authority and not as the scribes. Friends, brethren, this is the Son of God that is speaking not only to them, but he's speaking to us today. As we are going through this sermon, you don't need to look at it from the standpoint of, well, this is Micah's sermon. This is not my sermon. This is the Lord's sermon. You're not just listening to me, you're listening to the Christ. And the type of awe and amazement that they had is the same type of feeling that we should have. This is great. This is God's Son speaking, not just some man reading and giving his interpretation. But this is deity, that which is divine, and he is telling us like it is. He's not holding anything back, and he's not sugarcoating one bit of this. Either you will do what I say and be wise, or you will ignore what I say and be foolish. Pretty simple. Straight to the point. This is the greatest sermon that has ever been presented by human lips, by the mouth of man. And it should be listened to over and over and over again. Because Jesus says, if you will not listen and do, you will be lost. And so I cannot ignore that. I cannot ignore this. I cannot close my ears to this and try to set it to the side. So the question must be asked by all. Does Jesus have authority in your life? That's what he's trying to gain. That's what he's wanting to do. We sing the hymn, King of my life, I crown thee now. How many people actually mean that? If somebody is your king, you have to follow them without question, without hesitation. And yet we have a whole host of our brethren, as I said, This is not just for the denominational world. This is for us. We have a whole host of brethren that they will assemble today to hear what the Master and the King says. But they're not going to do it. Oh, but I've been baptized. That's not all that Jesus said. Well, I'm here. I'm singing. I'm giving. We prayed together. That's not all that Jesus said. What's your life like when you leave here? Is it built on that rock or is it built on sand? And if you're looking around and you're seeing that everything is crumbling, you can change your location. Change your location and start rebuilding. And start rebuilding your life in Christ. For those that are not members of the Lord's church, that means that you must give up your past life, be willing to leave behind those things that are sinful, and have first that desire to live as Christ wants you to live. Be willing to confess His name before witnesses that He is in fact the Son of God, and that you'll be baptized in water for the remission or for the forgiveness of sins. But once you've done that, the journey is just beginning. We are finding out, we're reading. You have to hear my sayings, listen to my teaching. Before Jesus left this earth, He gave the commission to His apostles to go out and to teach all men to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. It's not a matter of, well, I like this, so I'm going to follow that, and I don't really like this so much. I'm going to get rid of that. It's either you're going to do all, or you might as well not do any. And for us that are members of the Lord's church, we need to recognize life is hard. Whether you're in the church or out of the church. And many people think, well, if I leave the church, life will get easier. Oh no, you'll have the same problems out there that you're having here. The difference is that inside of Christ, you have hope to make it through. You have a support system. You have teachings and instructions to guide you. It's almost like a break glass in case of emergency type deal. So just because the storms arise doesn't mean we need to jump ship. That we all of a sudden need to leave the house. No, the house is where the safety is. And if we found ourselves wandering outside of the house, you can always come back. If we're willing to repent and confess. So for anyone that has a need, we offer this time of invitation as we stand and sing together.